Okay, so it's 6 o'clock, and I would like to welcome everyone to begin our evening tonight on the topic of abolitionist economics. My name is Julia Ott. I'm the director of the Heilbroner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School for Social Research. I'm also an associate professor in the history department. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel this evening, and then we will, turn it over to them to begin their discussion. Our question and answer feature is live and functioning right now. So those of you who are in our audience tonight, feel free to begin to add your questions to the Q&A function from the outset as the conversation is developing. Obviously we'll break for the panelists to contemplate and answer your questions, but there's no need to wait till the end to start populating that queue. So as I said, I'm Julia Ott, director of the Heilbroner Center for Capitalism Studies at the New School and associate professor of history. It is a great honor for the Heilbroner Center to be hosting this event on abolitionist economics tonight. And for that, we have to thank, of course, our panelists, of course, our communications assistant, Layla, Lynn, but most of all, we have to thank our colleague, Assistant Professor Jackie Wang at Eugene College in Culture and Media Studies, the author of Carceral Capitalism. Jackie has pulled together an amazing panel for us tonight, which she will be moderating, and she will be posing your questions, audience, to our esteemed panelists. Let me introduce them now. We are very pleased and very honored to have with us tonight Jasson Perez, a writer, organizer, and researcher who studies the connections between leftist organizing approaches, political movement formation, policing, incarceration, and economics. He works to create political projects that connect organizing fights for economic, climate, and social justice to the politics of abolition, decolonialization, and socialism. Jasson's writing and research has appeared in Dissent, Spectre, Jacqueline, the Action Center for Race and the Economy, and the Cook Center for Social Equity. Before he was a researcher and writer, Jasson was a lead organizer for SEIU Local 73, and BYP 100. When Jasson isn't selling his labor for sustenance, you can find him rapping with the rap group BBU and organizing with the DSA's Afro-Socialist and Socialist of Color Caucus, as well as Defund CBD campaign in Chicago. Our second panelist tonight that we're so happy to welcome is Anastasia Wilson. She is an assistant professor of economics at Hobart and William Smith College, where she teaches courses in political economy, principles of economics, economics and gender. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she studied political economy, economic history, and heterodox economics. She is involved in the Center for Popular Economics. Our final panelist this evening is Alex Goodwin, currently a senior organizer for the Action Center on Race and Economy. She also organizes with BYP 100 in Chicago, and she is the co-founder and writer of Left Out magazine. Her writing and activism are centered around the momentum and the challenges of building Black power and self-determination. Her work at ACRE, the Action Center for Race and Economy, currently focuses on the relationships between the finance industry, policing, and tech, and how these things exacerbate racial oppressions in our nation today. So, I wish everybody, all hundreds of people who are listening tonight were here to give a warm welcome. Maybe I'll do that on everybody's behalf, and I'll turn it over now to our colleague, Jackie Wang. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that lovely introduction. I want to warmly welcome our panelists tonight. This is a panel that I've been thinking about since this summer, putting together something, bringing together people who are working on the economics of incarceration and policing. So I do want to acknowledge that this panel is inspired by a blog post that Anastasia wrote this summer that is titled The Economics of Abolition. So I can actually post it in the chat if people want to check it out. And it's a post that kind of goes over the literature on the political economy of prisons and police, the way in which contemporary capitalism is so fundamentally tied to policing and incarceration, but also outlines other ways of thinking about the economy and what it would mean to move towards an abolitionist economy. So I am not an economist, but I find it really fruitful as someone who does capitalism studies to think with people who are heterodox economists. That was one of the main reasons why I decided to, join the New School faculty, because there's an amazing, robust legacy of heterodox economics. But I'm also really inspired by the work that activists are doing around defunding the police, the work that activists have been doing around digging into municipal budgets and actually following the money. So organizations such as the Action Center for Race and the Economy, Alex and Jasson are affiliated with ACRE. They publish an amazing report on police brutality bonds, which really traces how the financial sector and Wall Street benefits from police violence. So I published a book titled Carceral Capitalism, which is about the political economy of prisons and police. I have a brother who is incarcerated, who has been incarcerated for the last 16 years. So it's something that I've been thinking about, especially as someone who's from the state of Florida, which kind of embodies a certain set of policies that scholars have referred to as Sunbelt penology, where even though it's a dynamic economy, there has been this turn towards neoliberal social policies and punishment in the forms of mass incarceration. So it is a huge honor to have the set of panelists that we have with us tonight. So I'm going to start off the panel by allowing each panelist to speak for 5 minutes to offer introductory remarks, and then we will move to a Q&A amongst the panelists, and then a Q&A bringing in the questions of the audience members. So let's start with Jasson. Thank you. You have the floor now.
Oh, thank you. Hey, what's up, y'all? Jasson, he, him. Yeah, I guess, yeah, just to go in on who I am. I mean, I came to abolition and I came to economics. Basically, yeah, so I got locked up. I was incarcerated for about 10 months. And before then was in and out of jail, and very, foster care institutions, things like that. And when I look back on what actually saved my life, got me out of street life, got me like just so that I wouldn't go back in and out like I was before, and like how a lot of my friends were, was I was able to get a job, right? And I got a job that paid a living wage. And then also luckily that job was connected to the movement, right? So and the movement provided a level of community that I didn't necessarily get in any other spaces I had been in before. And then I was able to learn a craft or a skill, right, which was organizing. And I was able to learn that through the job that I had, but also through like the community that I had. Another aspect of it was that I was able to live in, after a while, I didn't need to live in halfway houses anymore, because at the time I was on parole, and I was able to live in a cooperative house that allowed me to afford the things I needed to afford, and also like food and all these other things that at the time I didn't know how to really cook for myself, still barely do, but keep a clean house, all these different things that like cooperative housing allowed me to do. And then, I'm in recovery. So then I was able to be part of like a 12-step program, right? And so, going back through it, all the carceral or punitive things in my life never actually put me on a path to like have some sort of agency in my life, have any sort of affirmation, serve others, any sort of thing, right? It was only the things that actually, gave me another chance, and allowed me to like figure out who I was and who I wanted to be in the world and the universe. And, and all those things, at least for my opportunities, right? I can't speak to everyone, right? It all came from, either some form of government, because the thing that allowed me to figure out the job that paid 15 was through a government jobs program, right? Government jobs programs have their problems, but that was part of my story. It paid a living wage, which, another aspect of government policy. But then also I had space within like non-government and non-profit type spaces either, that allowed me to learn organizing, that allowed me to access to housing. And then lastly, like it was a nonprofit that taught me how to organize and gave me the job opportunity that I had. And so, I say all those things because, right now within abolition and also within economics in general, right, there's like a tension between what is our relationship between the government and the state, what is our relationship between like nonprofits and what does that mean, or even the academy, right, as a nonprofit, and what does that mean or not mean? And then also the idea of, I think what some people would call the commons, or solidarity economics, cooperative economics, but an idea like a life beyond beyond the state and beyond capital. And for myself, all three of those things contributed to at least my political consciousness in terms of becoming an abolitionist, but it also connected myself to the idea of like, why economics is important, and I think, right now I'm excited because, if someone would have told me, like a year and a half ago that like millions of people would care about a municipal budget, like would just like care about it, would like, like hundreds of thousands of people would go, they would like lobby the person, they would do protests on it, they would care about all the different details, they would look through it. Like that is mind blowing to me, right? I've been, I was a labor organizer. We could never get anybody to care, even like workers who were public workers, to ever care about the public budget, like never cared about it. So I think that's like an amazing opportunity. Also, if you would have told me that people would have cared about how much we actually spend on policing, and that policing in and of itself is part of the reason why we can't achieve any of like the egalitarian economic promises that we want, that, the reason why we don't have Medicare for all, the reason why we can't visualize like even like cooperative housing, why, wherever you land on it, that part of the reason why we can't vision that is because of the punishment economy that teaches things like meritocracy, that teaches things like the deserving and the undeserving. And so, I'm just excited about this moment. I know there's like a lot of back and forth within the moment, but I think it's a good moment to like build a lot of good things in abolition and economics.
Thank you so much, Jasson. I totally feel you on the point you made about it being surreal that so many people care about the municipal budgets. I was just thinking, when I was first starting to dig around and research municipal budgets, I remember talking to Destin Jenkins, who's a historian at U Chicago, and we're like, yeah, you really got to understand municipal finance to understand racial capitalism, but it's so boring and technical. But it is really great now that we have done the work of politicizing budgets and actually paying attention to where resources go and how much money police departments in particular are gobbling up of the municipal budget. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Anastasia now. You have the floor.
Thanks, Jackie. And thank you so much for inviting me and sharing my very messy notes on something that in the middle of the night I called the Economics of Abolition. That blog post was as much about me learning as anything else. So I have a hard time thinking off the top of my head these days with the Zoom fatigue. So I did prepare some opening thoughts. And this is to map that conversation that Jasson was referring to, these debates we're having sort of back and forth about what is the pathway to abolition in terms of economics. So I'll just basically read those. A thought that runs through my head when I think about the notion of abolitionist economics is economics is a trap. A famous economist once said something about how the purpose of studying economics is to avoid being deceived by economists. As a discipline, keyword discipline, the primary function of economics is the bourgeois science of managing capitalism. But the tools used to do so, especially when demystified from their oppressive function, still may offer important insights into mapping the terrain for struggle for abolition of policing, prisons, and violence, the abolition of carceral capitalism. But I say economics is a trap because different frameworks within economics and political economy have varying degrees of compatibility with upholding and legitimizing, or potentially rupturing, the logics of carceral racial capitalism. To sub some words from Marian Kaba, try everything and experiment. And here we will try and experiment to start building an abolitionist political economy as we walk and question and talk together to avoid these potential traps. I have many critiques of mainstream economics of crime, from ethical issues of data collection, its role in surveillance, and to the technocratic economism that drives much of the research. While many of these analyses move away from moralizing ideas about criminality, the economics of crime does little to interrogate why criminality is constructed in the first place. There's limited discussion of criminality and its relationship to capitalism, work and expropriation, anti-Blackness, patriarchy, settler colonialism, and imperialism. There's also limited analysis of the other actors in the economic model of crime. The construct of criminality is not just about the so-called criminal, it's also about those who do the policing, those who choose and benefit from the policies and priorities of the carceral apparatus, and who participate and benefit from its enactment. But what if abolition is a lens that we can view the economy through, rather than just growth, incentives, costs, and benefits? I propose that we can use abolition as a lens for building a political economy that centers how to actually work towards making these carceral institutions economically obsolete, to borrow words from Angela Davis. This talk, of course, is at an institution that shares my own approach to economics, which is heterodox political economy, where we can see through the rhetoric and demystify the mainstream, while building a political economy that recognizes carceral systems as a central feature of capitalism, rather than as part of some separate social sphere of issues. So if we look further into broader approaches to the issue, like those found in post-Keynesian economics, Marxist and post-Marxist approaches, as well as other alternative schools of thought, we can look to map the terrain of an economics of abolition and work to center abolition as a framework for a political economy. Post-Keynesian approaches help us to interrogate the disciplining role of public spending and budgets and surplus population management approach to understanding incarceration and its relationship to employment. These insights also argue that we both may begin disrupting carceral logics by boldly investing in communities instead of in policing and prisons, as well as to how to see the connections between sectors like finance and real estate and the carceral apparatus through gentrification, financialized public finance, fines and fees farming, and debt. And these approaches also propose specific disruptive policies: reparations, housing guarantees, debt forgiveness, investment in health and care, public banking, and many others, along with participatory processes. And as we go in developing this abolitionist lens for understanding the economy, Marxist and post-Marxist approaches can help us to understand how capitalism is always innately carceral by design, and that criminality, like our subjectivities of race, gender, class, and other axes, is produced and socially reproduced through this capitalistic organization of society and work. This includes the imposition of work and the organization of our social relations vis-a-vis capital. Capitalism compels work and therefore value by relying on coercion and domination under the threat of violence, especially that which is state sanctioned. From this perspective, it turns out that the invisible hand is more like a velvet gloved iron fist. These approaches from heterodox political economy can offer us analysis, strategies, ideas, and styles for thinking through this project of abolitionist economics together, interrogating the role of the state, and for finding potential points of rupture. This can hopefully lead us towards liberation, repair, and an economy and society based on people meeting people's needs, rather than imposing work or fostering autonomy and addressing conflict, rather than coercion through punishment and exclusion. There may be some policies to advocate for, like expanding public goods and services, or perhaps strategies involving a solidarity economy, mutual aid, refusal, and other ways that can shine light towards that path to abolition. But as we walk and question our way forward, it won't be the words or theories of economists that are the condition of possibility for abolition, but our collective participation in struggle and the mapping of the terrain towards autonomy and liberation can make our break from carceral racial capitalism. So out of care, I emphasize to be mindful of the traps set by economics, but I'm hopeful for struggling while we walk and question towards that path to abolition.
Great, thank you so much. Give me 1 second, my phone alarm is going off. Sorry about that. That's the comedy of modern life at play. I just like tossed my phone on the other side of the room, and an alarm that I sent yesterday appeared to be going off. That was a really great overview of your thinking about economics and capitalism. It reminded me of this book that I taught recently titled The Prison and the Factory, which is about, it basically makes the claim that all industrial capitalist societies have prisons, and it's intimately tied to bourgeois property relations. So we really need to fundamentally challenge capitalist property relations to challenge carcerality overall. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand the floor over to Alex now. You have the floor.
Cool, thank you. Thanks y'all, good afternoon and good evening. Again, my name is Alex, I use she and her pronouns. And thanks for having me, Jackie, thank you for the invite. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I just want to start by sharing gratitude to the Black anti-capitalist freedom fighters that I've learned from, either through reading or just like sharing space with. And rather than name names, I just want to bring that more collective history into this virtual space, because I firmly believe that I wouldn't be here having this conversation. I don't know that this conversation would be possible without the work that has happened before us. So like most of us, I think my politics did not always include or involve abolition, but as someone who I consider myself radicalized by Ferguson. After that, abolition became pretty much a no-brainer. And not only in that moment did police brutality make it back onto a main stage, but we're also talking about the economic impacts that police have on public services, and also the way police are used to bring in money to balance budgets, particularly through fines and fees. And I think that that's, what Jasson and Anastasia shared in their opening remarks, something really consider when we're talking about the larger impact of policing. So in 2018, ACRE released our report, Police Brutality Bonds, How Wall Street Profits from Police Violence, which I think we'll talk more about, so I won't go too into detail. But working on that report in particular taught me that we should be considering costs of policing outside of just the police budget. And also that Wall Street and corporations are playing a direct role in enabling police brutality. And so this report came out in 2018, but really had sort of a revival last year during the uprisings. And I think what was truly illuminated last summer in ways that maybe we have not been illuminated on or amplified on such a large stage, but that police were being used to protect capital and protect property. It was very clear, it was very obvious. And so after seeing some of the things that we saw last summer, I believe, and we'll say over and over again, right, that police are the muscle of racial capitalism. They are the enforcer, they are the gun, essentially, that is going to hold the status quo through violence. And, to fully defund and abolish the police, we also are going to have to address this invisible financing arm or this invisible support that police have through Wall Street and corporations. And I think also what came up for me last summer during the uprisings was also the importance of tying defund conversations and abolition conversations to revenue and budget conversations and conversations about the economic impact that the wealthy have also like on our municipal budgets. And so I think like overall sorry, it's got super loud outside of my window. That's a little distracting. But I think overall, right, we have a chance to be very deeply anti-capitalist in this moment, in this movement moment around defunding and abolition in a way that has potential to be like much longer lasting, I think, than we've seen before, which is really exciting to me. And so, I'll just wrap by saying, in considering like what an abolitionist economy is, I think that it prioritizes the wealth and comfort of communities that have been traditionally and historically marginalized. An abolitionist economy doesn't prioritize the growth and expansion of violent and carceral systems. It redistributes wealth and doesn't leave room for loopholes for the growth of a capitalist and wealthy elite class. And I think like probably most importantly, to me at least, an abolitionist economy is one that is like intentional and thoughtful about its implementation, but also flexible enough to be adjusted, I think, when things are not working. And so with that, I will just say like, thank you. I'm so excited to talk with the three of you today.
Great, thank you so much. I remember when I was organizing with a divestment group when I was a grad student, we read the police brutality bond report and we're like, minds were blown. So it made the rounds even before this summer as well. And we'll have more time to talk about the report because it came up in the Q&A. Someone asked they wanted to know more about the connections between Wall Street and police brutality settlements, so we can go into those details in a little bit. I wanted to start things off with a question for Anastasia. You covered some of this in your short address, but you can expand where you think necessary. So as a heterodox economist, can you talk about why it is important to use abolition as a lens? And you already talked about the ways in which prisons are tied to capitalism, but if you want to expand your analysis and talk about how structural changes in the US economy really drove mass incarceration. And then I was really struck by what you said about economics as a discipline normalizing surveillance through the fetishization of data and the economics of crime. So if you want to expand on that, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Sure. So my idea, proposal, provocation is thinking about how we can use abolition as sort of a framework or a lens, the same way that economists tend to use other sort of metrics or standards as a way of looking at the economy, growth rates, distribution, income, all of the standard things that you would learn in an economics class, be it mainstream or heterodox. But what if we reoriented towards thinking about how to build an economy that completely minimizes the role of coercion, of domination, of use of force, of policing, prisons, punishment? I think to me that sounds like a really compelling idea. And I think that actually economics and thinking about how we design economic systems could learn a lot from things like transformative justice and conflict resolution, because so much of the sort of justification for, oh, why do we have markets? Well, they efficiently distribute things according to the textbook, has to do with things like conflict mediation. But we should actually be thinking about conflicts over resources in, I think, a more transformative way. And maybe economists could learn something about that. But again, that's mainstream economics. And like I said, I'm a heterodox economist. But even in heterodox economics, I wasn't seeing a lot of discussion about the carceral state or prisons or the role of policing as sort of central to the analysis, with a few exceptions, of course. But the thing is that I know just from life that this is such a central thing that shapes our lives. Like, and I think about how the carceral state shapes labor markets. Like, I have a brother-in-law who has so much back child support debt from being in prison that he can't work a formal job because his wages will get garnished. So that's structuring his labor market experience like so directly. Yet you don't see it mentioned in economic models, even heterodox economic models. So I feel that it should be a lens for our analysis. If this is the type of world we want to live in, it should be the lens that we look at the economy through. To speak to the second part of your question, which was about sort of the mainstream economics of crime, there is, I think, a lot of ethical questions about crime economics, about the use of data that is often the result of surveillance. So for example, I've seen papers written based on the CalGangs database, which is a form of surveillance in California. And I think it raises a lot of ethical questions about those data and where they come from and the power structures that underlie that recording of data. How reliable is it? Because the people who record it are also the people who hold all of that power. So that's a really big question. And I think it raises some really important points about when we look at these studies that are sort of prescribing lean management techniques for the state in terms of policing and incarceration and trying to reduce whatever variable they're looking at. So I think there are a lot of questions there to be discussed and to also just be aware of when we're looking at that literature.
Yeah, that is really well put. And I think it's a problem in the social sciences as a discipline overall, because even people on the left who work on some of these issues don't really challenge the fundamental way in which prisoners or people who have contact with the criminal legal system function as essentially a laboratory for social experiments. And we do need to question how that data is generated. So this is one of the fundamental problems with predictive policing. It basically reproduces past patterns of discrimination by taking historical crime data, which only really measures police contact with people, and then sends police officers to the places that have been historically policed. And then they say, this is a race neutral model that we're using, even though it reinforces historical racist patterns of policing. So that's a very, very important intervention. I'm going to ask Alex a question now about the Action Center on Race and the Economy report on police brutality bonds in Chicago. So why is it important to pay attention to municipal finance? And as you said, not only municipal finance, but the way in which basically taxpayers and other people who are funding the city of Chicago taking out bonds to fund police brutality settlements. Why is it important to look at these things when trying to understand policing as a form of racism? How did you go about conducting this research, and what impact did the Acre report have?
Yeah, so excited to answer this question because after 2-3 years, I finally fully know how to talk about police brutality bonds in a way that was still, something we were working through. Even, I think, and I say that because, these financial instruments like bonds are just made to be so complex on purpose. And so I think this report was exciting to be a part of because it really broke down some of that, like, I don't know how to describe it, but it broke it down in a way that I think really makes sense and like could actually be very beneficial to our organizing. And so just a little background, a police brutality bond is when a city borrows from a bank to pay for a police brutality settlement. They are done differently in different cities. Chicago was probably the worst case scenario in our report. And if there was like maybe a best case, the best case would have been LA in terms of like transparency. And so I think, the way we did the research was through using this like bond marketplace sort of database where you can find all of the municipal bonds that are issued in a given time. And if folks want, I'm happy to drop that link, but we were just doing a lot of cross-referencing between like news articles about police brutality settlements and then like looking to see if a bond was used to pay for, or would be used to pay for this settlement. And I think, something that was like very much illuminated, especially in working on Chicago's research specifically, and the way like municipal finance or these local budgets are racist, is I think like it creates this like very ugly cycle, in that like, I'm like, where also because it's a circle, I'm like, where does it start? We know that corporations and like the wealthy essentially do not pay their fair share into our local budgets. And so we're looking at our public services essentially being divested from because there's not this money coming in. This divestment creates, I guess, blighted neighborhoods, poverty, violence in these areas, which is then used to justify more policing. And as there is like more policing into these places, right, we're like boosting the police budgets in that way. We're creating more risks for violence and settlements as a result. And we are essentially further eroding a tax base the more police we throw into an area as a result. And so again, with more money into police and less money from us as taxpayers, like we are then creating more room for Wall Street and corporations to then privatize. And I think it just like creates this very like cyclical thing that directly impacts Black people in particular, Black and brown communities and poor communities in particular. And I think there are so many things to say about these police brutality bonds, but I think one of the more important things, right, is that through the process of these bond issuance, like Wall Street is profiting. Banks are making an immediate profit off of police brutality, and then investors are making a long-term profit during the life and maturity of the bond issuance. There was one more thing that I wanted to say, and it just kind of slipped my mind. Oh, I will also say like this process, I think further helps police escape transparency and accountability. What that looked like in Chicago was the city would borrow or issue a sort of like general obligation bond, which would include like a list of like 20 things that the bond proceeds could pay for. And like within that like long paragraph of 20 things is like, this also might be used to pay for police brutality settlements. But when you are trying to track those things using, in talking to the city or using what is publicly available, they then can't tell you how much of what proceeds were used to pay for what settlement. So, this is also outside of the police department budget, outside of the settlement budget for police settlements. And so essentially, like police departments are escaping accountability. They're escaping transparency for how much they're actually costing us as taxpayers. And it also, again, like I said, in my opening remarks, this sort of just pushed us to think about like, what are the costs of policing outside of the department budgets? Because there are so many things that we are actually paying for. One just like last example I'll give in terms of like how the research has been impactful. Again, in Chicago, there was a fight against the implementation of a cop training academy. And they told, the city and the administration at the time was saying that the cop academy was only going to cost, I think it was either $43 or $47 million, which is still a lot of money. Just want to name that. But what it actually turned out was that to pay for the rest of the cop academy, they would be issuing a bond or essentially borrowing money, which then ballooned the actual cost to over $200 million for this cop academy. The taxpayers would be paying, down the line over time. And so I think like those are the sort of things that make this research worth it, right? Is being able to highlight just the different ways that police are actually impacting not only our budgets by taking up a big chunk of our budgets, but like also how it is directly impacting like taxpayers' abilities to put money into other things.
Yeah, that's precisely what I found so powerful about the report. You actually see that something that is pitched as a form of reparations is a transfer to Wall Street, to the financial sector, literally draining public funds and transferring it to the financial sector and saying it's a form of reparations. So I think it's so important to kind of follow the money and see how these things are set up. Even when it comes to municipal bonds, if you want to drop the link, I think it would be super useful for students, especially with their research projects, and maybe they're just curious to poke around. Even in classes that I've taught, we talked about municipal bonds in my carceral technologies class, because we were talking about the construction of Pelican Bay prison in California and how they use lease revenue bonds to try to sidestep getting voter approval for general obligation bonds. So there's all kinds of elaborate financial engineering that can be used to basically, just expand the carceral system. So my next question is for Jasson. And I listened to a podcast of you talking about abolition and democratizing the Fed. And I was like, I need to talk to this person. So that was also, in addition to all your amazing work, why I invited you to this panel. But can you talk about the relationship between reparative public goods and universal public goods? What kind of fiscal and monetary policies support the financing of reparative public goods? And has the COVID crisis created political openings that we can build on? So I remember in the early days of the pandemic, after the CARES Act was passed, a lot of people invested in modern monetary theory, were very excited about the creation of the municipal liquidity facility, and particularly the possibility of using public banking to support municipalities. So making the claim that there's no reason why we have to impose austerity on cities and states. We could actually use the Federal Reserve to fund public works. So I would just be curious to hear you talk about these topics.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, for reparative public goods, I think the idea, what we're trying to get at, and what other folks are trying to get at, is that policing is technically a public good, right? And right now we're seeing like there's a big stimulus that got passed and a bunch of money for supposed public goods, right? Supposed military is a public good. Prisons and jails are public goods. And so we want to move towards, we want to move away from that, right? That being defined as a public good. And also, I guess move away from the idea that it's like universal or whatever, right? So, and so the idea of reparative public goods is that we need to, when we're talking about what is universalism, and Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton does some of this work too around targeted universalism, that we have to think about how do we distribute public goods and create public goods and services that actually take into account anti-Black slavery, settler colonialism, extractive colonialism, heteropatriarchy, carceral borders, right, mass incarceration, all these different types of things. And that, we need, in order to be truly universal, it has to be reparative. And it actually has to like build up a meaningful definition of what is the public good, right? And so, so at least for myself, right, as an abolitionist, obviously I'm biased, right? Policing is not a public good, right? It's not something that actually makes us safer, allows for an egalitarian economy, and allows like, BIPOC communities to thrive. So, we want, and also too, you see this a lot on the left too, right? Sometimes there'll be like Medicare for all, but then it won't be for folks who are undocumented, right? Or other forms of like universal basic income, but then it won't be for folks who are incarcerated. And so reparative public goods like says like, no, you have to account for that. Like you have to do that, whether it's a goods program, a services program, or like a guarantee program, like a jobs guarantee, or a home guarantee, things like that, that we can no longer build, like the social democratic state where it still, includes various types of exclusions based on deservedness or whatever. So, to like the fiscal and monetary points, I mean, there's a lot there. I do want to just, I guess, to my friends, to my homies who are, abolitionists or decarceral or defund, right? Like, why should you even care, right? Like, why, why does it matter? Why do these fights matter? Why does this struggle matter? And this even came up in, in organizing conversations and like defund CPD work and other defund organizing work, where it was just like, we just need to focus on defund. That should be our focus. We shouldn't worry about progressive revenue. We shouldn't worry about progressive finance. So, does this even connect to abolition? Does this have any meaning to it? So, first I would like to say that like, within the history of Reconstruction, right, that, that's, where we get the, one of the first instance, like actual happenings, but then the idea that, that working class folks, particularly, Black working class folks, should be able just to tax the rich to like fund public services and goods, right? And that's a lot of what was happening during Reconstruction. And of course, white rich people were upset about it. And then that's, that's where we get the conception of the taxpayer, right? And the taxpayer being a dog whistle for being that, these people who just came out who were just slaves a few years ago are now taxing us and then deciding what to do with our public money, funding schools, funding all these different types of things, right? So there's that connection, right? And then there's the other connection of the Black populist struggles. And a lot of times we think of populism as like this white thing, but there's also Black folks who are a part of populism, the populist movement. And especially for, trying to get financing for their farms and trying to actually get meaningful ownership so that they couldn't get so they wouldn't have to share crop, right? And so they also struggled over issues of public control of banking, financing, and taxation. And the idea was that if you didn't have public control of those things and like commons control of those things, then you would be reduced back to a form of slavery, right? Either via sharecropping or literal slavery by another name with convict leasing programs, which were like bringing in a lot of folks at that time. So there was always this connection that the continuation of like the carceral state, the police state, was deeply tied to your ability as a people and as a and leftist political project to be able to control publicly public budgets, but also banking and finance. So then what does that mean for now, right? So I'm trying to figure out like how, like, I don't want to get too in the weeds. My friends always like warn me that I get too much in the weeds.
I give you permission to get into the weeds as much as you want. Okay. I know I have a lot to learn from listening to you. So I say, if you want to, don't feel shy about it.
Okay, so just like on the, I think, kind of at the most basic level, right? Like progressive revenue fights, right? Whether it's progressive progressive taxation, right, which is like, we tax rich people, right? Or, which is important because it reduces richest people's class power, right? It makes it easier to beat them, which we want to do because we want to abolish the capitalist state one day. And then, or progressive finance, which is, super important because it allows us to control the machinery of money production, right? The machinery of finance, right, is controlled through banking. And if we're able to democratize that, take that over, then, we no longer even really need to care about, taxing rich people. But it gives us a much stronger advantage, right? So, but why does all those fights even matter, right? Why does some of my friends are money abolitionists, right? They're like, they don't believe in no money, right? And so I would contend, first of all, that there's a difference between money versus capital, right? That money is a public good, is a public utility, and is a common utility, and that through the privatization of what money is, it becomes what we understand to be capital, and a thing that can be owned and used by capitalists. I think the second part is that, progressive revenue organizing, it does transform people, right? And the fights for it transforms folks, right? So it changes like how we think about our relationship at like the interpersonal, communal, societal level of, how we conceptualize money, how we conceptualize budgets, how we conceptualize revenue. And it moves us away from this, the ideas of carcerality and scarcity, right? Which I believe are related. So nowadays we get taught that money and revenue, especially, right? And even capital, right? But especially money and revenue, whether it's the money we get for working, selling our labor power, or the money we get in public budgets, or even the money that corporations have and they say they can't do A, B, C, but they always seem to be able to, right? We're taught that it's a scarce thing, right? And there's only so much of it. And that what gives value to it is like what rich people think in their brains, and then they go and make it happen, right? But, progressive revenue struggles actually teach us that, first of all, taxation is this thing that has the possibility to be an egalitarian force in our lives, that socializes not just our wage labor, right, but our social labor, especially the social labor connected to like social reproduction theory, right? So taxation is a force that says that like we all have public and social obligations to each other and communal obligations to each other. And through that taxation, then we also have a thing that actually it's what gives value to money, right? And allows money to be this infinite, abundant property that can fund all the things that we want, right? There's no reason to believe in like a scarcity of money, and in the scarcity of like investing that money. And so, why is that important? Because when we're always thinking of money and revenue and resources as scarce, right, it leads to like austerity type thinking, right? It leads to that we don't have enough money for things, but it also leads to like ideas of deservedness, right? And it's where we get to the idea of the welfare queen, right? Or the undeserving immigrant, or the person who's formerly incarcerated who should not get access to A, B, and C because we're always in a scarcity model. And so, I think in order to have a transformative vision of what abolition is, like, we want to abolish prisons and jails, A, because like they suck, they don't keep us safe, right? But we also, like as organizers, strategists, we want to, because we know when there's less police, less prisons, it allows us to organize easier, right? The current prison system that we have is in response to the social movements of like the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so we want it because of that. But, we also want people bought in and feeling energized by this idea that that we really do have all the resources that we need. It's only a matter of political questions in terms of why we don't have those those needs met. And most people aren't going to learn it through a Zoom, right? Most of the time they learn it and realize it in the mode of organizing and in the mode of battle, and actually seeing the revelation for itself. And I think, or the actions of institutions. And I think, that connects to the last point of like, we've seen the COVID crisis, we've seen how folks have responded, right? And it's the same thing, but people I think are a little bit more activated, right? Which is the idea of that there's always money for more, there's always money for police, right? But then there's always like, you always never enough money for the things that we need in our life. But I think people no longer believe those types of things because they see that there's always money for corporations, right? In a crisis, there's always money for all these things, but there's never money for the things that we care about and are important to us. And then at a technical level, it's been revealed through the municipal lending facility, but also through like how corporations have been empowered in this moment and banks have been empowered in this moment, that we already have the banking infrastructure, we already have the financing infrastructure and fiscal infrastructure to provide all these needs. It's just a matter, it's just a set of political choices by capitalists who choose not to do so. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was really well put. I wonder if capitalist class, financial class are going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle, because now we know that there's no reason why they can't fund these things that they say that they don't have the money to fund, whether it's public education, housing, and so forth, food as well. Higher ed, canceling student debt. I mean, there are so many areas of social life that are underinvested in. And the claim is always that there's no money, but whenever it comes to police, prisons, and the military industrial complex, there's never the question of, well, how are we going to pay for it? And I do wonder if this particular moment that we're living through, this weekend, a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill was passed, and there wasn't taxation prior to the passing of that bill. I feel like it's going to be hard to sell austerity to people after this political moment. I don't doubt that they'll try to do it, but I do wonder if something really deep is going to shift in the public consciousness around some of these issues. I hope, at least. That's the Arundhati Roy pandemic as portal approach. We really hope that this has created a political opening that we can then take advantage of. So my next question kind of follows from a lot of the discussion that's happened so far. And the first part of the question is for Alex and Jasson. So it recently came out that Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot's administration spent $281.5 million in federal COVID relief money on the Chicago Police Department. As activists push back against austerity, challenge the deficit myth, and make calls for robust public spending, how can we ensure that the spending doesn't go towards the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex? And for Anastasia, can you also talk about the importance of shifting public spending as a pathway to abolition? And we can start with Alex.
Yeah, my initial thought when hearing this and reading the question was like, can we, how much people power is actually required to ensure that Lori Lightfoot doesn't use 80% of the CARES Act money on police, especially after saying that it wouldn't go to police, right? Like there were all these sort of assurances that were supposedly made. And then she did it anyways. I think, I'm always like, listen to organizers, right? Like the mutual aid networks are there. The demands from organizers are clear about where COVID relief money should be going, where public budget money should be going. And I just, I don't know that I'm having trouble imagining how we have that demand met that doesn't involve like a sort of like policy piece or like, you know what I mean? So, I mean, that is kind of where I will leave it. I would love to hear, Jasson, what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that touches on like, what do we conceptualize as public goods and like where money should go or not go. And back to that piece around reparative public goods and like, I believe in law, I believe in policy. So, and as Ruth Gilmore says, policy is the new theory. So you know, I believe like there's a there that we should care about. You know, in terms of like more on like the technical organizing side, like how do we, you know, no, there's several things that we need to do, right? I think so on like the left economic side of things, right? Sometimes about like the prospect, sometimes Jacobin, you know, like Doug Henwood showed, there's all this like left economics world. And, you know, they haven't made a commitment to the idea that like, you know, bad public spending, bad public goods is money that goes to police locally, right? In prisons, right? There's just not that commitment. There's not like that constant media narrative and framework for folks, right? That's only very much in abolition circles. And so, you know, like left economists or left political econ world has to embrace that and put that front and center. So I think that's the first part. You know, I think the second part is, and sometimes people push and shove against this, is that like, you know, you need a pretty good block of, you know, actual explicitly radical politicians or elected officials to be able to talk with, to be able to build with, and also and let them know like this has to be a fundamental line that you cannot cross, right? The only reason why Chicago Tribune even cares about this issue, right? And I mean, not the only reason why, but one of the important reasons why Chicago Tribune cares about this is because, you know, members of the Socialist Caucus made it an issue for Lightfoot to even have powers to be able to do with the money as she wanted, right? So there was already an idea of a watchdog around it. So I think you need that aspect, you need the electoral aspect of it. And because you can have progressives who, there's plenty of progressives out there who won't even say defund, who won't even care about those things, won't even look at those things, they think that all public spending is good. And then, you know, you need street heat, right? And like by street heat means like, I mean, you know, for sure we need mutual aid, we need these other building alternatives, that's important, right? And gives us the fuel so that we can do these other things, but you have to engage in mass disruptive protests, right? At the scale that we saw last summer, right? But it has to be planned and it has to be constant, right? And that's the only way that we actually move. I mean, the idea is that, you know, we're gonna try to move the public on this issue. And then because we move the public through mass protests, then we will be able to move, you know, the elected officials. But that also means not just like community organizations or movement organizations, but labor organizations too, like doing forms of sympathy strikes, doing forms of, you know, wildcat strikes and other actions that actually put folks on the ground. And it's not just lobbying, you know, like the weakness right now with defund is that, you know, we're getting into like a lobbying frame of mind or like a mutual aid frame of mind. And though both those things are important, we need to do this, but on top of that, we need mass civil disobedience, you know, thousands and thousands of people and turning folks out like that. And that's what will put, you know, Lori Lightfoot and other Chicago mayors at their heel to the point where, you know, they won't do things like that with the CARES Act. And I guess one more thing too is that, like, I mean, we do have to figure out a strategy of how to get, you know, our federal representatives to also put pressure that, you know, when they're doing these stimulus packages, when they're doing these things, that, you know, it explicitly says this is what it goes to, this is what it doesn't go to. And, you know, it's not even that they've said no to folks. I don't think anyone has ever asked, you know, any of the current representatives, I think even within the squad, hey, make sure that all the money is earmarked towards non-carceral things, right? No one, we don't even have that fight, you know, and we could have that fight, maybe lose it, similar to how we did with Cori Bush and prisoners, like, and being able to vote, but we should at least be having that fight and bringing it to the public consciousness so that people know about it and we can polarize around it.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it. I like that, you know, the way that you framed it. Not only do you need the radical politicians who have control of the levers of power, but also street movement. You need people protesting, putting that pressure, because at the end of the day, I think politicians, I think that the way that the political apparatus is designed is that they're not going to do anything unless that pressure is there. I mean, even looking, you know, I appreciate the expansion of the squad that's happened, but you've seen people just get co-opted as they become politicians. Like in the early days, AOC was, you know, doing a sit-in outside of sorry.
Pelosi.
Pelosi's office, yes. Why Nancy Pelosi, yes. So, and you see a lot of these hardball tactics kind of going out the window as people are like, okay, no, we got to do it through the channels the proper way. Yes, we wanted, you know, a vote for Medicare for all and these kinds of things. And you actually have to be willing to stop things from moving to make it happen. Anastasia, do you have any thoughts about the importance of shifting public spending as a pathway to abolition?
Yeah, I think that's a crucial pathway. I mean, right? Like right here and now, people have so many unmet needs that could, as Jasson and Alex are saying, could easily be met, right? There's no how do we pay for it problem. That is a racist dog whistle at best. Like, it is not a real constraint that exists in this world. And we have plenty of evidence that it doesn't, right? Like, you can pay for the prisons and the military and all of that without having to check the budget. So yes, that's definitely an important pathway. But I think the same issue, just like Alex and Jasson were mentioning, is this idea of accountability. Like, when those demands are not met in the way that they were demanded. And I agree with Jasson that type of accountability doesn't just happen in the budget meetings, but it also has to happen through keeping the street heat of sort of refusal and disruption to make sure that accountability is held. The other thing is also thinking about things on like a super hyper local level, like when you're involved in a local decarceration or abolitionist group, you can learn about sort of the local politics of, you know, the local sheriff elections and things like that have really deep impacts on people's lives right here and now. And so that's also part of those pathways, is keeping an eye on and involvement in all of those movements.
Yeah, really, really great wisdom you're all bringing together here tonight. This is a somewhat adjacent question as well, and I think it relates to what you were saying, Jasson, about your friends being like, well, don't we want to abolish the money form? What are we doing here talking about monetary policy? You know, we got to keep your eye on the revolutionary horizon when you're doing your work. And it just made me think of debates that often happen in abolitionist circles around the question of the state in particular. So I kind of came out of a, you know, anarchist Black Cross tradition of anarchist political organizing and anti-state thought. And my entry into abolition was really through studying the social movements of the 60s and 70s, looking into COINTELPRO, thinking about the politics of state repression and the police and prisons as an extension of that repressive political apparatus. So I kind of came from a very anti-statist perspective with this, like, we are against all forms of authority, you know, representative democracy included in that mix. But there's also another abolitionist tradition that really comes out of the work that Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis have done, and specifically Marxist abolitionist tradition that is rooted in Black power and the Black radical tradition and a critique of racial capitalism. But Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls for the pro-state state, which seems to be, you know, very much in line with how you're thinking about reparative public goods as well. So I would just be curious to hear from all of you, what are some critical approaches to understanding the role of the state in relation to abolition? We can start with Jasson.
Okay, yeah. I mean, for myself, I want the abolition of the state, right? I want the abolition of capitalism also. And how we get there, I believe, is is like a within, beyond, against approach, right? So within is anywhere from like what we think about with defund stuff, or things around like our fights for like universal basic services, or basic income, job guarantees, public banks, things like that, right? And even electing electing folks. And then I think about like beyond, in terms of like the actual alternatives that we build, right? Building out the commons. So cooperative economics, solidarity economics, time banks, local currencies or complementary currencies, things like that. Mutual aid, right? The work that we do with mutual aid. And then against, right? And against is like mass protest, mass disruptive protest. So I guess, I don't mean like those, like, I mean, you can have those too, but, like there's like the sanctioned kind of like, you talk to the police and there's a thing, and then there's like a march, but I mean disruptive power in the, Francis Fox Piven sense of that, you break things in terms of either you break the status quo, or you actually break property, and other like, authoritarian forces like police. And I believe in that from a nonviolent spectrum to a violent spectrum. And I think movements have to do all those things really well in order to achieve like the smashing of the state. I think where I disagree with some of my comrades is that a lot of times they believe it's only smashing of the state, and it's not also transforming the state and the economy. And I think the transformation part is important, right? I think the fights, because usually the more transformative fights in terms of transforming the state and the economy are usually ones that, those are kind of like the real fights that, at least I know, like my mom or my aunt or people actually I can communicate with. They kind of understand. They just don't dismiss it out of hand. I might have one uncle who would be down on like the insurrectionary thing, sort of, because he was an army deserter. He was down with FALN back in the day, which was like a Puerto Rican insurrection group. So, but that's not necessarily a common sense among folks, right? So, and it's important that, and that's usually what brings in like a mass amount of folks. And we have, they have more money, but we have more people, and so that's like an essential part of it. But so then comes like the beyond part of like, what do we want afterwards? For me, I still believe in government, right? I believe the fault line between the difference between a state and a government is a state is its authority is conferred by having a monopoly on legitimate violence and coercion, right? And so to me, that is what the state is, right? Or what Gilmore and Davis call the anti-state state. And so, and for me, a government is, the public authority that is actually democratically controlled in a participatory democratic model and a radically democratic model, and at some level representative the democratic model by the people, right? And to me, then that puts us in the space of like the pro-state state. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a state, but there might be semantics, right? But then, I think there is meaningful things, especially like the points that Joy James has been getting at lately. And I think even Ruth Gilmore gets at this, is that, the idea is that we don't want to abolish violence per se, because that's impossible to abolish violence. It's just like, we want to be able to control the means of violence and how it gets meted out, right? So, and then there's a whole kind of King and other tradition that speaks that that's impossible, but then there's like an Anastasia Shakur, Joy James, other tradition that says that we can do that and that we should do that, and we should understand that that's what we're doing. And the biggest pushback is that once you have the moment of revolution, there will be, of course, a counter-revolution, or, while you're having a moment of revolution, there is a counter-revolution. And so we need to defend ourselves against those counter-revolutionary forces. And then that means some sort of capture, that means some sort of incarceration, that means some sort of policing, that means some sort of military force. So, yeah, I don't know where I'm at on that, but yeah, that's just kind of how I think it through. I think my biggest thing though is that I think we always really need a both and approach, a both and then whatever else is out there that we can't, like that speaks to like the experimentation ethos of abolition, and that like putting in our like you know, oh, that's status, that's this, that's BS, then, you know, I don't think that's a good idea. You know, I think we need, because, you know, if we have the context of transformative justice, it should be community driven, it should be within the community. But then, and we run into an issue of that all we do is individualize it, right? And within the idea of that, like all these individuals should have all these skills, there should be no specialization, et cetera. You have to have some sort of concept of how do you make and form a society that people can actually be a part of and don't have to know every single thing in order to like have this thing called public safety or have these like goods and services, even though they don't have to work for them. So I think that part is important because, you know, libertarians are anti-government. Libertarians want to defund the government. You know, libertarians don't want any state also, right? So we have to like be specific about what we mean in terms of the vision of what we want. And it should be community, it should be skill building, but it also has to, you know, up a higher level in terms of what is our vision of governance or government also, so.
Yeah, really, really great points. I also think about the fact that, you know, given my age, within my historic memory, there's never been a pro-state state. And so to me, it's really easy to be like, the state is just this, you know, it's about the monopoly on violence. It's about austerity. It's about prioritizing militarism and police over people. But that might have to do with, you know, when I was born and what I've seen the state do in my lifetime. So I do want to turn to the audience Q&A in a couple minutes, but I will let Alex and Anastasia answer if you have any thoughts about the state.
I thought Jasson gave like a really full, comprehensive answer and hit on some of the things that I was thinking, so I won't add anything. Just also want to offer Jasson some gratitude because that was really good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that this is a big...
Oh, I'm sorry. So sorry. I wouldn't even work at Acre if it wasn't for Alex. Sorry, I just needed to throw that out. All right, please.
I think this is a big question. It's kind of like the elephant in the room, if you will, when we're talking about abolition, is the state. What conception of the state do you have? Is it porous? Is it workable? Or is it always going to be a tool of capital? And are we always going to have to face that reality that you will be up against a lot of violence and force when you're trying to move it forward the way you want it to? I think that's a big question that we have to keep hashing out. We're not going to hash out the answer here. I myself, I feel really concerned. Sometimes when I start thinking about the role of the state, when I think about the ways that sort of the carceral apparatus creeps into even things that we think are sort of good, schools and social work and all of this is so caught up in the carceral apparatus, family law, like all these things. And so that's where my apprehension comes from. It also comes from thinking about the way that movements and community groups at the local all the way up level can get really co-opted. And that might actually just end up being a form of surveillance and all of this sort of concerns. So I probably share more concerns about the state, but I also think we can have multi-track thinking, right? Like we can be critical while we're also demanding a lot. And that's fine. And we don't have to sort of fight about that, right? Because we can do both at the same time, it's fine. We all operate in really contradictory positions in a society that's based on coercion and domination, right? So that's the reality of it. But I think those are the questions that we're going to be confronted with, and as we keep sort of building this movement forward.
Yeah, I similarly wrestle with these issues in myself, and it does make me feel like I have to live like a bifurcated existence. So I'm going to turn to some of these questions in the Q&A now. So there is a question about, and this is a question that I wanted to ask anyway, so this is at the top of the queue. What are some ways to embody abolitionist economies in your own life/community? And how can we cultivate this in the present moment? And yeah, anyone who wants to take it, if anyone has any thoughts.
I mean, I give so much money away all the time. I think, I'm a big fan of redistribution of wealth. I saw something on Facebook, so take that, do with that what you will. But it was about how Black people give away more of their wealth, I think, than any other group by race. And I thought that was really interesting, and also like really indicative of what we saw, all what I experienced, right? And also, I just remember during the uprisings, right, there were like a couple of organizations, I think in Minneapolis, right, that just like got like $3 million just based off of like donations, like individual donations. And that was actually really inspiring to me, because it just shows like what is possible when we pool our money together. It sucks that like that's what it takes for us to do those sort of things, or make that possible, but also like, again, that it is possible. And so I just, like I am a very big fan of giving what I can, folks within my circle and folks who are not. That is what it looks like in my own, I think, yeah, my own experience, my own life right now, especially.
Yeah, mutual aid is really important. And definitely this summer, it was like an outpouring. There's so much happening on that front, especially even, around bail funds in particular, but also in the early days of the pandemic. It was like, hey, so someone can't afford their rent. Let's just, redistribute some funds. So that was, it felt like it kind of died down a little bit, but I still see a lot of campaigns circulating, but not to the degree that it was during this summer. Anastasia, you've thought a bit about cooperatives and cooperative economics. So if you want to share anything about worker cooperatives as part of the Abolitionist project, feel free.
Yeah. I think they're definitely part of a set of experiments and options, and maybe there's limitations, but I really appreciate the work of Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, who was the author of Collective Courage, which is a wonderful history and economic thought about cooperatives, African-American cooperatives in the US, and then also has done quite a bit of work and research on cooperatives for currently incarcerated folks and previously incarcerated workers. And I think those are really interesting options. There's also a lot of work in the solidarity economy, speaking of, give your money away, is also on like finance cooperatives. The work of Caroline Hussein Shanaz, where she talks about Roscas and social finance, and the type of mutual aid that people have always and continue to provide within their communities, I think is really powerful, and that we should all be sort of aware of that sort of thing. And also, yeah, just giving your money in terms of mutual aid to people in your community that need it.
Yeah, if there's anything you want to add, Jasson, feel free.
Yeah, no, all those were great examples. I think the only thing I would add is that, I think it's important, like doing, in terms of like, how do you embody, right? Like where does the moment of embodying come from, right? So, and I think, a lot of embodying comes from, for sure, meditation, other things, but reflecting, but I think also doing, right? So, actually, doing the work of mutual aid, I think has doing the work of building alternatives like cooperatives and participating in them and being part of them, especially like when you're having a debate and talk through like things of like do we let this person in or not? Do we need to ask this person to leave? All these things of like what we think of when we're talking about like meritocracy, carcerality, like all comes from being part of like collective and cooperative projects, even mutual aid, which I think are important. And then I would also say though that like having those mutual aid projects, being connected to like forms of, you know, what we would say is like formal political action, right? So it's like, you know, mutual aid work that then is connected to, you know, protester actions at like the, you know, like what the, National Welfare Rights Organization used to do, like at food stamp places, or like hitting up elected officials demanding that you provide these sorts of things because you're supposed to. So, you know, I always think like those kind of embodied things, also part of the embodying is like you doing it, but then also figuring out ways that it can actually scale to the world so that, you know, it does actually meet, you know, people's fundamental like survival needs, you know, and because, you know, the Panther idea was, you know, survival pending revolution. So it's like, you know, it's like these embodied form of abolition economics pending revolution and in service to that.
Yeah, that's really well put. I was also thinking about that in the early days of the pandemic, when it actually, you know, was the case that people were just left to drown. And it was really inspiring, all the mutual aid that happened around people being evicted and, you know, not being able to pay for groceries and these very basic fundamental life things. But how do you also, in addition to doing that work, make a demand on the state? Going back to this question of the state, that part of the equation was really important as well. So I'm going to bring in some more questions from the audience. So this is from Darian, who is at John Jay in New York. And it's specifically about police officers and prison guards as workers, and even thinking about the history of organized labor. You know, during the neoliberal period, it seems that police unions and correctional officer unions are really I guess, maybe also firefighter unions as well, but only a handful of unions fared well during this period when organized labor is being crushed. So Darian asks, if you had the chance to interact with these future police officers and prison guards who might be looking for something like a pension and a stable salary, what would you want to say to them? And how would you broach the topic of abolition and alternatives to prison, and the socioeconomic overdeterminations of capital in a way that are accessible to people?
Can you say that last part again?
So if you were to, because John Jay, you know, they do heterodox economics, but they also do criminology. So there's a lot of people going into, you know, policing or criminology in some form or another. And, you know, since we have a structural analysis, we don't want to blame individuals. I've also heard, you know, people like Ruthie Gilmore really calling on the labor union to kind of kick police officers and COs out of the labor movement. So what would be a way of like deterring people who are looking for a pension and a salary from going into you know, being an extension of the carceral state?
That's a really tough question. But if I were to sit down with these students, and I've had students who are in a similar position, and I think it's a conversation of really understanding our positions in carceral capitalism, of understanding that what might give you a benefit might be at the expense of someone else in this system and the way this is set up. and to really sort of confront and think about this. You know, I think it was like last semester or something, I had a student who said to me, we were talking about like trade, and we were talking about like the, you know, the global imbalances in terms of like inequality. And the student was saying, how come Americans, when they buy these products, say you're buying something that was made in a factory with like forced labor, really bad conditions somewhere else across the world, the students said, why don't they think about that? Why don't they think about those workers? And I think that's sort of the opening of the conversation of, you know, you think about the products of your labor and where that's going. But it's also the real contradiction of the fact that those are good jobs in the sense of pay. But that's a hard question. So I don't know if Alex or Jason have other thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that came to mind was also I guess, the question of needing to, you know, beef up organized labor in other dimensions, in other industries outside of the security state, to just, you know, make sure that those aren't the only secure jobs that actually still have a pension. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep track of the chat here. I'm like interfacing with summaries of questions and the questions. So I'm sorry if I didn't ask this question totally accurately, but Darian, if you want to put it, oh, sorry, I didn't see the first part of this question here. So Darian writes, my immigrant father spent over 5 years in prison, oops. And his twin brother was deported back to Zambia in 1998, in both cases due to acts of violence against women. Currently a grad student, undergraduate college tutor in the heterodox economic programs at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and volunteer EMS provider and street medic in New York City. I find myself one day teaching future police officers and the next day in direct confrontation with the NYPD. These experiences left me questioning how to deal with the positive feedback loop of violence in kinship networks and how to address these issues without incarceration. And to view police officers and future police officers as unfortunate pawns as both guardians of capital and weaponized and unprepared social workers with guns. Many of the criminal justice students I tutor come from extreme poverty and are almost entirely Latinx or Black, and their motivation to join the criminal justice system is often motivated by personal experiences of violence. My apologies on the Q&A, only the last part of the question was at the top here. But if any of you have anything you want to add now that we have more context for the question, feel free.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think if you're, this might be a little too crude, right? But I think, you know, we got to take a page from, you know, really good, strong anti-military work, right? Which is, and especially the activism we saw during the Vietnam War, which is, you know, like we need to organize counter recruitment, like, the policing and police are beyond reform, right? And we know that, and while we know that the people brought into it, right, are maybe not in on that, it's our jobs as organizers, or if we have abolitionists, if we're committed to abolition, to figure out ways to like organize anti-police recruitment campaigns similar to what we see with anti-military ones. And the anti-military ones, especially in times of like high intensity conflict, are work and are effective, right? Just as, you know, it gets harder to recruit police and it gets harder to retain police when there's times of mass uprisings being critical of police. So, you know, I mean, for sure, I think just people need to be clear in their thing of that like police can't be reformed. There is no reforming to police. I mean, and obviously we need strategies that like where you provide other better paying jobs and do other better paying jobs. But, you know, I think organizing against police still has to be front and center versus, I don't know, like trying to have like this like reasoning kind of thing of, you know, I don't know how effective that approach would be. And then, and like for something like John Jay, right, or like these schools, right, these criminology schools, right, I mean, that would mean similar to what happened in like military bastion schools, right, where you organize against those programs, right, or you organize saying we want an abolitionist criminology program, we do not want a police officer pipeline program, this is why, this is what it's going to be about, this is why we're doing that. And you have to like up the ante in that and polarize in that way, I think, in order to like deter folks away from those kind of occupations.
Jason's answer reminds me of a better answer than the one I gave, which is thinking about cops off campus organizing and like thinking about abolition in terms of your syllabus and your practices in the classroom. And I'll put the Cops Off Campus Coalition link in the chat for that exact reason, because that is a really important part of campus organizing as well.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. So this is another question from the Q&A, and it's a big question. What is unique about capitalism in the U.S. that it requires the world's largest carceral state? Huge question here. I'll open the floor if anyone has any thoughts. As we were saying earlier, the US exceptionalism, it's somewhat deceptive because mass incarceration is international, in that we see rises in the rates of incarceration happening in other parts of the globe outside of the US. So even though the US is an outlier in our rate of incarceration, I think that sometimes thinking that it's only a US problem can lead you to think that there's something just about the US rather than about capitalism that is the root of the problem. But nonetheless, we still need to grapple with this question of why in the US is the rate of incarceration so high? It's a huge question, but if anyone just has preliminary thoughts, feel free.
Well, we're in the heart of the empire built on slavery and settler colonialism. So I think I would start there as to why.
Yeah, I guess like there is a certain preservation of whiteness that is here in the US that, I mean, I haven't been abroad. I am not like a global expert. I just know what it looks like here and what my experiences have been. And I do think that a big part of that is like, yeah, that preservation of whiteness, preservation of white supremacy, that is possibly more present here than it is in other places that are maybe, you know, I guess like less diverse or less of a melting pot, right? Like part of that American dream is that the US is such a melting pot. Yet, you know, at the same time, like that melting pot represents a threat to the status quo and capitalism here in the US and abroad. So I don't know if it's not like a perfect answer, but.
Yeah, I mean, it really gets at a lot of debates on the left around the causes of mass incarceration, because some people want to say that it's not about race, but I agree with Anastasia that settler colonialism and slavery are really at the root of the problem. But if we want to think about the history of the 20th century, we've had what Brendan McQuaid calls a Herrenvolk welfare state, where redistribution has been narrow in terms of it really being, about creating a social safety net that will reproduce white supremacy. So Jasson, if you have any thoughts and want to close us out, feel free.
No, it's going to be closed out, but no, just, yeah, there's the debate, right? Clegg and Usami kind of have the economics mass incarceration is underdeveloped social welfare. And then there's a response from Specter that actually, kind of went through all the reasons of like why that doesn't hold, right? And shows that, a lot of the countries that they're comparing to, also had at times quote unquote underdeveloped social welfare states. But then, you run into the problem of like, Australia is fairly white supremacist, settler colonial. Canada has its own history, not as intense, of course, of slavery, of racial slavery. And then you have Brazil, right? And at least for me, like it's the closest apples to apples comparison of like United States, to me is Brazil. And then I think that's where I fall on the thing of like, I don't know if it's that exceptional, right? And even if you look at something like, South Africa then too, and seeing how policing is intensifying in mass incarceration. And I'm only doing these places because they're places where there's either extreme forms of colonialism or slavery and then a racialized population. And, I do think part of the issue was how vibrant of a social movement we had, right? I do think that, camps incarcerating the crisis actually speaks to how scared and how on the heels of capitalists were and how much, the empire struck back. And I think that has a lot to do with it. There's consequences when movements are successful. But then also, I do think there's a relationship between like social welfare, social welfare provision, carceral forms of social welfare. And I do believe that we have a political process that creates political constraints that incentivizes punishment more than other areas. The only area that I really see that's similar to that is South Africa and also, Brazil. So.
Yeah, really, really, really well put. My pet peeve about the underdeveloped welfare state argument is if it's a Herrenvolk welfare state, how is it not about race? But we could talk about these. I mean, especially this last question is so huge. We could talk about this all night, but alas, we are out of time. But I just wanted to thank Anastasia, Jasson, and Alex for joining me. And it was a really great conversation. I learned so much from you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I don't know if you want to close this out, Julia, but
trying to I'll just say goodbye and thank you to everyone. I think my video camera has been turned off by the administrator. So there's a big red J saying goodbye and good night and thank you to everyone. Take care and stay tuned and more events from the Heilbroner Center coming up this spring.
Great. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Take care.